This is my take on some of the events surrounding Jesus in Capernaum, looking at them particularly from the point of view of the ruler of the synagogue there, whose name, Luke tells us in his Gospel, was Jairus. My name is Jairus, and I am responsible for the running of the synagogue in Capernaum. It's a responsible job involving arranging who reads the scriptures, who speaks, what we pray, and who sits where. I have a good team of folk helping me, so that it all runs smoothly enough. I also own a small vineyard, the grapes from which make the most excellent wine, even though I say so myself, and I have several orchards of olives and dates from which I produce the finest olive oil and the most succulent dates. Now I would like to tell you of the strange events that have been happening recently, and hope that you will be able to help me make sense of them. Firstly, there is this carpenter, from Nazareth of all places, such a small, dirty little village with a miserable shack of a synagogue. Anyway, he turns up and starts talking to some of the local fishermen beside the lake. This carpenter is a good Jew, and he comes to our synagogue every Sabbath, and some of the fishermen begin to come with him, which is good, but they do smell of fish. As I said, one of my tasks as leader in the synagogue is to arrange who takes part in the services, reading scriptures, sharing a word, etc. And this carpenter guy, Jesus is his name, was keen to take part. Initially, I was not so keen, his friends smelling of fish and all that, but whenever he read scripture, somehow it seemed to come alive. And whenever I gave him opportunity to share a word, I always came away feeling that I'd had a shower in the purest spring water. Others must have felt the same, because quite early on in his stay in Capernaum, he provoked quite a response from one of our regular attenders. Zuph was his name, and he was a very dirty man, both in body and spirit, and he definitely smelt worse than fish. One morning when Jesus was preaching, Zuph just started shouting, and Jesus told him to be quiet, and Zuph gave out a mighty scream, fell on the floor, and, well, basically, since then he's been smelling of roses, and no one has heard a foul word pass his lips. This was naturally very good for synagogue attendance. Jesus' teaching was fresh and easy to understand, and the episode with Zuph made people want to come and see what was going on. One of the fishermen he is friends with is Simon. Simon is a huge, impetuous, angry man, and to be quite honest, I'd rather see him on a fishing boat than sitting in my synagogue. He makes me nervous. Anyway, apparently his mother-in-law was sick, and Jesus healed her. Later that week, there was quite a lot of excitement when Simon returned from fishing at the wrong time of day and in the wrong place in the lake with a huge haul of fish. Apparently, Jesus had told him where to fish, which is really very unlikely, because what do carpenters know about fishing? Several weeks later, Jesus was staying in one of the larger houses in Capernaum, and a large crowd had gathered, asking him to speak with them. I had managed to commandeer a couple of seats for myself and a couple of VIPs from Jerusalem who had come to Capernaum to hear Jesus for themselves. Anyway, there was this paralyzed guy who could not get through the crowd. So his friends took him up onto the roof, made a hole in it, and lowered him down right in front of Jesus. I remember the look on Jesus' face was one of amusement and joy at their determination. Unfortunately, he went on to tell this guy that his sins were forgiven, and my friends from Jerusalem went bonkers. This man is a blasphemer. Only God can forgive sins, they said, and I had to agree with them. Then Jesus told the paralyzed guy to get up and go home, which this guy did. Everyone was astounded, including us. Some were praising God, but we were wondering, how does a blasphemer manage such an act of healing? Jesus didn't help matters the next day by calling Matthew, one of the most unsavory of our tax gatherers, to join his band of followers. Matthew responded by throwing a party and inviting all the worst lowlife in Capernium, and included Jesus, who dutifully attended too. Not a good way to impress Jerusalem. And that Sabbath, things only got worse. News of Jesus was spreading around Galilee, and it was beginning to be difficult to get our own folk into the synagogue because of all the visiting scribes and Pharisees. I had asked Jesus to speak, as they'd all come to hear him, and to my horror, I saw Daniel, a local stonemason, sitting in the front row right in front of Jesus. Normally he would sit to one side out of the way because his hand had been crushed and deformed by an accident. Everyone was sitting in different places every week now because of all the visitors. But there was Daniel in full view of everyone, mangled hand and all. As Jesus began to teach, he looked at Daniel and he looked at some of the visiting important people. And to cut a long story short, he leapt into the lion's den and Daniel got his hand healed. But it was the Sabbath. Bit of bad timing there. You just cannot go around healing people on the Sabbath if you are a good Jew. It is just too much like hard work. Things got worse. A few days later, Jesus was returning from preaching on a hillside outside Capernaum. Agricola, the centurion stationed in Capernaum, came to us and begged us to go and ask Jesus to heal his servant. Agricola is about as good as centurions get. He had been stationed in Capernaum over 10 years ago and was instrumental in building of our current synagogue. So you could say that we owed him a favour. Not that those from outside Capernaum would understand, because the Romans are our enemies. Anyway, I was in that party asking Jesus to do this. And then, to cut a long story short, Agricola's servant was healed. Not a good move when looked at from the outside, aiding and abetting the enemy, etc. To cap it all, Simon, one of the other Jewish leaders in Capernaum, invited Jesus to his home for a meal. If I had been Jesus, I would have been terrified. He was just a carpenter from Nazareth, as his accent made very clear. But when he arrived, he was calm and courteous, which is more than I could say of some of the other guests. These sort of meals are quite important social occasions, so there's a lot of coming and going around the main guests reclining at the central table. There was this girl hovering around to one side near Jesus. No one noticed her initially until she started to cry, and then came forward and cried even more all over Jesus' feet. This was very embarrassing for Simon, especially as it slowly dawned on people as she began to pour very expensive perfume on his feet and wipe them with her hair, that this young lady was a sex worker. Some folk were scandalized that Jesus was letting such a woman touch him, but they were even more upset when he told her that her sins were forgiven, and she skipped out of the room as if a great burden had been lifted from her. It's all so confusing. Here is a poor carpenter from Nazareth who speaks with a thick country accent, whom it is rumoured is a bastard, and who hangs around with smelly fishermen and nasty tax gatherers, attends disreputable parties, and who tells people their sins are forgiven, lets sex workers wipe his feet with her hair, and does healing work on the Sabbath. Can this man be a prophet from God? My friends from Jerusalem say he must be possessed by Satan. Yet when he reads the scriptures, I hear fresh things. When he teaches, I understand how to live. When he forgives people's sins, they are different. The dirty are set free and cleansed. When he heals people, they stay healed. And apparently he can even call fish out of deep water into a net. Can a demon do all that? And leave people giving thanks to God? My responsibility is to the synagogue, and at the moment it is full to overflowing. The tithes and offerings are increasing every week, and everyone is talking about God and Jesus. Where do I stand, you may ask? Well, my friend, I actually sit very firmly in my allocated seat in the synagogue and will not take sides. Now, I have a daughter, and she is 12 years old. She is my only daughter, my only child. She is so beautiful and happy. I thank God daily for giving me such a wonderful child. She is to be betrothed soon, and we have a young man in mind from a good family. God has blessed me and my wife so greatly with her. But now she is sick. She's wasting away, and there's nothing we can do to help. The doctors we have called have said that she will die. I can't bear it. My wife can't bear it, and my wife's sister is planning the funeral. What am I to do? My daughter says to ask Jesus to come and lay his hands on her, and she will get better. She likes Jesus. All the children seem to like Jesus. He tells them stories and makes them feel safe and laugh. I'm a little more pragmatic. Do I really want some crazy demonized man touching my daughter, even if he can pull a big crowd into the synagogue? My sister-in-law doesn't like Jesus. She has heard rumors about his dubious parentage and says he's not a proper rabbi. And how can he be a prophet from God if he breaks God's laws by working on the Sabbath and forgiving sins when only God can forgive sins? Who does he think he is, she says, the Messiah? I know quite a bit from chatting to him in the synagogue. He's a nice enough guy. So maybe I will ask him what he thinks about my daughter's illness. So I hear that he's down by the fishing boats and head on down, but as I arrive, one of the larger boats is sailing out into the lake. I've just missed him. I begin to feel a little anxious. No one knows where he has gone or when he will be back. Still, I'm sure there's no urgency. My daughter is ill, but not at death's door. Yet. Some of the folk seem to be planning to stay down by the shore to wait for his return, so I give one of them a coin and ask him to send a message up to my house when Jesus returns. When I return home, my daughter is worse. She seems to be much weaker, and I'm beginning to get worried. She looks so pale and far away. She asks me if Jesus is coming, and I tell her that he is, but he has gone fishing. Gone fishing? What a lame thing to say. My daughter is dying, and the one person who can possibly help her has gone fishing. My wife has made her some special soup, but she won't try it. None of us have eaten for a while now. How can you eat when your daughter's dying? A storm begins to blow up in my feelings. I was calm. There didn't seem to be any rush, but now things are beginning to look bad. I need to do something. When Jesus comes back, I won't just talk with him. I'll beg him to come and see her, and maybe she's right, and if he touches her, she will get well. I'm not sure if he has a demon or not, but if he can heal my daughter, then that's okay with me. The minutes pass and I begin to feel like screaming and running around and throwing things. Maybe I have the demon, I think, as I begin to feel so out of control and full of panic. She's fading away more now. There seems to be less and less of her. If Jesus is fishing, he has certainly caught me now. I have nowhere else to go. My wife is crying. My sister-in-law is talking to the mourners, and I don't know what to do. At last a messenger comes from the beach. They can see the boat returning. Now I can do something. I start to run. When I get near the beach, there are hundreds of people. Where have they all come from? I was glad to pass the word around the local towns that Jesus was in Capernium. Very good for our synagogue, and also for the local trade. Wine, olive oil, figs in particular. But now that seems to have backfired on me. Too many people everywhere, trying to see Jesus, trying to hear Jesus, even trying to touch Jesus. It's such a crush. I've never seen anything like it. Jesus' disciples are trying to push away through the crush, but it's slow work. I'm desperate now. Normally I would be all polite and excuse me, please, you're standing on my foot, but today I have this feeling that there may not be much time left. I dive into the edge of the crowd, pushing and shoving and shouting, and even finding myself beginning to cry. I can hear people beginning to curse as I stand on their feet or elbow them in places they would rather not be elbowed in. Would you believe it? Some people actually purposely try and get in my way. I'm making quite a spectacle of myself. Very humbling for a leader in the synagogue. Someone recognizes me and calls out my name. It's Jairus from the synagogue. And as others pick up my name and distress, so they begin to let me through. At last I'm close enough to Jesus. There's a little space. There were so many people I was pushing against. Now there is space and I can no longer stand up, and I'm on my knees at Jesus' feet. He has his hands clasping onto my arms to stop me falling down completely. He recognizes me. He knows my daughter. He knows that she has been ill, but he also knew that I'd been using him to pull the crowds, so to speak, and to make Capernium famous. I looked into his face. Please come, she is dying. And I am trying unsuccessfully not to cry. He sees my agony, and I think I see tears in his eyes. Do demons cry? He nods, and I begin to lead the way. So many people, too many people. I've been so good at publicizing this man. We can hardly move, we can hardly breathe. Then suddenly he stops, and then this is somebody else's story. It's not a long story. It's a touching story and a story of healing. But it's long enough for my daughter to die in. There is no more time left. And now he is unclean, contaminated by the bleeding woman who has just touched him. And we start to move again. I see one of my servants reach the edge of the crowd. He looks grim. The news he brings can only be the worst. Eventually we get through to each other. She is dead. Don't trouble the master anymore. I feel like screaming. So many people, not enough time. And how can an unclean person heal anyone? And I'm crying again. Jesus grabs my arm. I'm tempted to pull away. He's unclean, and now he makes me unclean. But he pulls my head close to his. Don't be afraid. She'll be all right. And I'm crying again. My mind feels in a whirl. Jesus has always been a sort of celebrity to me, someone to be exploited to make the synagogue in Capernium famous and to make me famous. And here I am exploiting him again. Now I am seeing a different Jesus. I'm seeing a Jesus who is coming with me into my life, into my home, to help me when I'm feeling such anguish. I look at his face again, and I can see he is feeling the pain with me. As we draw close to home, I can hear the mourners beginning to wail. My sister-in-law has done a good job. If in doubt, organise something is her motto. I just feel sick with dread. She has chosen the best, out of respect for my position in Capernium, and there is a great deal of weeping and wailing beginning. The neighbours will be in no doubt somebody has died. Jesus is telling him in his best preacher's voice, "Stop weeping," and he adds, "She is just sleeping." I'm afraid that you do not tell professionals that they are wrong, and these were the best professional mourners in Capernium, and they know when somebody is dead and when to mourn. That's what they do. Their response was to laugh at him, and despite myself I could not help but think of Psalm 30 verse 11, "You have turned my mourning into laughter." Except their laughter was not that of joy, but rather mockery. They knew death when they saw it. Jesus cleared everyone out of the house, much to my sister-in-law's annoyance, and only took myself and my wife and 3 of his disciples with him. My daughter had been laid out in a very professional way. There was no doubt that she was dead. What little hope I had fled away when I saw her, and I put my arm around my wife and was just about to start crying again. Jesus looked at me and held up a hand as if to stop me. Then with his other hand he took hold of my daughter's hand, and in that same preacher's voice of command told her to wake up. And she did. She stood up, she looked around, and she said she'd like some of that soup now, please. Jesus was made unclean by the bleeding woman, and he took hold of my dead daughter's hand and made himself unclean all over again. Yet the woman was healed, and as for my daughter, well, death fled away. Bring any uncleanness to this man, and it cannot remain. Even the vilest is made new, and the deadest is made alive again. No demon can do that. Surely only God can do that, even if his timing does seem to be a bit out and we don't always approve of his friends. Jesus knew that I'd been his publicity agent, so to speak, and that I'd been doing it mostly for me and not so much for him, and that it had almost cost me my daughter's life. So he asked me not to tell people what had happened, but something like this is hard to keep quiet. She was only sleeping, I would tell people, but I knew she was dead. Jesus called her back to life. I think of Psalm 30 again. Jesus turned our mourning into laughter, and it is the laughter of joy. You may ask me now where I stand on this Jesus issue. Well, I kneel very firmly in my allocated place at the feet of Jesus, who has to be who my sister-in-law says he cannot be. He is the Messiah, the Son of God, and the one who called my daughter back from the sleep of death. And he came to my synagogue, and I heard him speak. And he is no longer a celebrity to me, but he is my friend.